moving into section 4.3, which is all about the Columbian Exchange. Frankly, probably the most important thing we will talk about, quite possibly in the entirety of this class, right? The Columbian Exchange completely changes how societies interacted. It completely changes the relationship of especially Africa and Europe and the Americas. And then it also really changes population growth, right? It creates this massive runaway population growth that we're still seeing to this day, right? So they kind of focused on the three major cultures that started to interact here, right? The indigenous Americans, the European colonizers, and the African slaves, right? That will make their way over under the African slave trade created by the Europeans, right? And so we see, again, the connection, the link of Eastern and Western hemispheres for the first time. That is probably the most crucial part of it, right? They've probably been connected at some points before, right? But not for this, sustained amount of trade, right? And they're able to share things, right? Share food, right? Which is huge. Share animals. And also though share disease, especially going one way on that. Okay, this is called the Columbian Exchange, of course, because of Christopher Columbus, right? It's kind of in the wake of his, explorations and discoveries, right? This also contributes to a changing global economy where all of a sudden it's been right? It's been kind of growing, but the focus of the global economy is going to shift away from Asia and towards Europe, right? And especially they wanted to talk about silver, right? Silver in Spain, which is going to be good for Spain until they really don't know what to do with it, as it leads to their downfall due to inflation. Okay. So start with diseases, right? So the Americans, right? The indigenous Americans have not been exposed to many people, especially not exposed to the Europeans before. And so because of that, and let's just say others as well, right? And so because of that, they had a very raw amount of exposure to diseases, right? And so because of that, right, we see the endemic diseases of the Europeans, right? So endemic, kind of just like natural to them. It devastates the indigenous Americans. Right, especially, of course, smallpox, right? And they talk about, the use of the European technological innovations and, or at least advantages militarily against the Americans did really help them conquer them. Nothing quite like disease really did it. And so we see the conquistadors, right? The Spanish conquerors, especially led by Hernan Cortez and Francisco Pizarro, right? Pizarro being taking over the Inca, and Cortez taking over the Aztecs, right? So the conquistadors helped bring these diseases with them, and especially smallpox, right? Smallpox probably our biggest, most responsible disease, right, for killing the Americans, right? So the Europeans have been largely immune to this because of their exposure to it over a millennia at this point, right? During the time there was the Justinian plague in the 400s, right, which was thought to be, or 500s, which was thought to be smallpox, right? But so because of that, right, what you see is that after generations of being exposed to smallpox endemically to the society, they had basically everybody who had survived was able to survive because they were naturally resistant, or at least had stronger resistance to this disease, right? That's not the only diseases that they talk about, though. We got measles, we got the flu, and we have malaria as well coming over to the Americas, right? And so we see the population fall by more than 50% through disease alone. So we see a 50% decline in population, in indigenous population via disease alone, and 90% in some areas, right? So this is, when we talk about the different population disasters in world history, right? When it comes to things like the Nazis and the Jews, when it comes to the Turks and the Armenians, right? When we come to those kind of things, right? Even those, might not even hold a candle up to what happened to the Americans, right? With the exception of, purpose with it, right? Disease, obviously one of the big kind of things that are brought over. But then we also have some other stuff, right? Is especially animals and food, right? Before this exchange began, Mesoamerica had very little meat, right? They mostly kind of lived off of beans and maize as kind of their main kind of baseline foods, right? And so the Europeans introduced pigs and cows to the region, right? And then we also bring wheat and grapes over from Europe to the Americas, which become staples of the diets, right? Later on in the society, right? But probably the most crucial domesticated animal that they brought over are horses, right? Especially transforming the culture of the American Indians culture on the plains of North America, right? Because all of a sudden, this becomes kind of their go-to economic structures, right? It's based totally around living on horseback, right? Especially hunting buffalo on horseback. They made their ability to hunt buffalo much easier, right? Or they're much better at doing it, right? And then we do see conflict arise due to this growth, right? Conflict amongst the tribes, right? Due to this happening. What did the Europeans get, though? The Euros get maize and potatoes. They also talk about things like beans, tomatoes, and peppers. But the other one they want to point out is cacao, right, which is chocolate, right? So these become staple crops in Europe, and not just Europe, throughout Eurasia, Afro-Eurasia, right? And so this leads to a massive population growth, not just in Europe, but throughout all of Afro-Eurasia. Okay. And of course, we see the forced enslaving of Africans, and they bring a lot of their culture along with them, right? Enslaved Africans bring changes as well. They talk about okra and rice, right? It's kind of new crops that they bring with them, right? And the main reason for the enslaved Africans is that they are there to produce tobacco and sugar and cacao. Sugar and cacao on plantations because, originally the American Indians had been enslaved, but the American Indians have been mostly wiped out. So the Europeans needed another source of cheap labor, or free labor. It's not necessarily free, right? You do have to. There are things that you have to pay for, right? But certainly cheap labor, right? Despite the enslaving of millions and millions of Africans, we do see population growth within Africa at this time due to the Columbian Exchange. Right? And especially the importation of yams, sweet potatoes, and manioc, which is a kind of a grain, right, that grew in much better places than other crops that were already previously used in Africa. Okay. All right. The other thing, and they did bring it up in kind of its own section. The big focus is on Brazil, right, and which is a Portuguese colony. And Brazil is focused on producing sugar, right, due to its tropical climate, right, and its massive amounts of land, right. And so it is in Brazil we see probably the most importation of slaves, right. Not only because they needed them to produce the sugar cane, but also because they needed the labor was so tough that the slaves would continuously die under the working conditions, right? Right, and they talked about taking it from the Congo Kingdom and the cities on the Swahili coast, right? And so they kind of go on, just talk about how, how many slaves went to Brazil. I'm not going to focus too much on that, right? You can kind of just say that. But they talked about how 90% of all slaves traded from Africa went to the Caribbean and South America. Caribbean, another place ripe for sugar production, right? And only 6% went to British North America, right? And then until the mid 1800s, there were more Africans than Europeans migrating to the Americas, right? We also see a lot of, again, poor working conditions, poor conditions in general, working and living conditions due to work conditions, due to poor nutrition, lack of shelter, poor nutrition, lack of adequate shelter. Right, and then the tropical heat and diseases that came along with that tropical heat, right? So we're seeing African slaves really being treated super poorly throughout most of this era, and this is really where you see European slavery kind of venture off from previous forms of slavery. And a lot of the previous forms of slavery that we've seen in many different communities, the way that the slaves were treated were not nearly as harsh as we see the Europeans treat them, right? Also, they talk about the sugar cane production in Brazil being known as engenhos, which is engines. Their explanation is not quite right. It's called the engenho because it's not just the sugar cane production. It also has almost these proto factories where they would turn the sugar into molasses, or the sugar cane into refined sugar, and then sometimes even that refined sugar into molasses and rum on the plantation, right? And so we also see the growth of cash crop economy. That kind of is the major economic source of wealth coming out of the Americas early on, right? They talked about especially sugar and tobacco as kind of the main ones, with sugar eventually being the thing that makes money, eventually even eclipsing silver, right? Okay, so last thing we want to talk about here is the African diaspora. Okay, so we have seen a few diasporas before, right? We talked about some diasporas in the Indian Ocean. We talked about some diasporas. We talked about the Jewish diaspora that happened multiple times and will continue to happen again. But here we have the African diaspora into the Americas. And much like the previous diasporas, right, we do see some aspects of culture, right, come with them. Not all of it, but a lot of it. Enough that it has shown its influence into the American cultures till today, right? We see a lack of languages really being kept because we see kind of the breakup of communities once they get into once those communities are enslaved and brought over to the Americas, right? Mostly on purpose, right? So we see a lack of language kind of saved from those African states, right? There is one exception that they do talk about in the Americas, the Creole language, right, which blended African languages, right, with the European languages, right? We do see that a bit in places like Louisiana today. There are some other ones, Gullah and Geechee as well, right? In South Carolina. Right. And so we see the Creole languages dominate, especially in the Caribbean, because there are so many slaves going to the Caribbean. Gullah and Geechee, again, in South Carolina, where, again, in the Americas or in the United States, the British colonies, you don't see a whole lot of Creole languages, right? They bring a lot of music with them, right? They're the syncopated rhythms and percussion that we saw them use, usually in terms of like religious rituals. those get brought over as part of the music that they bring with them. Right? So syncopated rhythms and percussion, which will have a massive influence on almost all modern day music genres, right? Um, and the reason that they use this is they use it as a means of survival, right? A way to kind of cope with the conditions, a way to get their emotions out, right? Their anger out, their frustration, their sadness, right? As well as to communicate with other slaves, right? And then they also created a new type of genre, blending the kind of Christian hymns, right? The Christian hymns that we saw a lot of enslaved Africans kind of forced to convert into Christianity, right? They combined it with their own religious songs, which they called spirituals, right? Um, and then they also invented the banjo, right? And then in terms of food, one of the key food innovations they bring over from Africa is gumbo, well as rice and okra. Gumbo being this kind of catch-all that brings a lot of food into it, right? To kind of just put a bunch of food together, right? Okay, so there's a huge list of Columbian Exchange stuff. I'm not going to go there, right? So we see a lot of, to kind of wrap this up, environmental impact in the Americas. We see a lot of deforestation, and with that comes soil erosion, right? The American Indians did not, the American natives did not really focus on farming nearly as much as the Europeans do. That's not to say they didn't farm at all, right? But they farmed and hunted, so they didn't cut down forests. Here we see the Europeans doing so, and when they do that, of course, it's going to lead to soil depletion. And then we also see much more denser communities, right, than we saw with the Native Americans. And so when that happens, we see a strain on water resources as well. Okay, and that is kind of it on the Columbian Exchange, right? A lot of negatives, some positives with population growth and the food diversity, right? But I think it's pretty obvious that just looking at it on the whole and in terms of who was impacted by the Columbian Exchange on the whole, you could very easily, and I would probably agree, make the argument that it was negative on the whole. But of course, massive population growth is going to keep accelerating from here on out, right? And so in the next section, we're going to talk about the maritime empires of these colonial powers. But until then,